I beg you to try it, Patricia.
Let me get this straight, Carla. You disagree on the weapon, you disagree on the number of blows?
Listen to me, Patricia. You were there once in your life.
Hi, everybody. It's Trish Wood here. And as you know, this is Trish Wood is Critical. I'll let you in on a little bit of inside baseball information about the show this week. This is actually a re-record of the introduction because a lot has changed in the last 48 hours on the fast-moving and terrifying story of Ukraine, Russia, the U.S. State Department, and nukes. And in service of that, we are interviewing two big voices on this crisis. One of them is Colonel Douglas Macgregor, who you've heard on the show before. He's kind of my bright star that I follow on this issue, which is hugely complex. And probably, I would say in my lifetime, the story that has been the most propagandized as far as foreign affairs are concerned ever. I mean, the lies that attend what's happening in Ukraine and who the players are being delivered by legacy media are shocking, and even more so than the fake WMD story that got America and other allied countries, not Canada, thank goodness, into the Iraq war. So he is our first guest, and he's going to debunk some of the stuff we're hearing. And also he has some interesting things to say about nuclear weapons and how they would or wouldn't be used in this circumstance. But the reason we're re-recording this morning, just so you know, is because overnight, President Biden has warned that the world is facing the prospect of Armageddon for the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, saying Putin is deadly serious about using tactical nukes in Ukraine. He's not joking. I agree with him that we are facing the prospect of Armageddon, but I think it is the ever escalating commentary by the Biden administration and Zelensky, and also obviously Putin, that is driving us toward this. You know, once the nukes start popping, tactical or not, it would be only a hop and a skip and a jump into a full-out nuclear exchange. And people of my generation understand that once that starts happening, it's over. You know, the world as we know it ceases to exist. You don't come back from that. So the idea that Biden is even using this now as a talking point at, I believe he was at a Democratic fundraiser when he said this, is just, it's unbelievable. Plus, General Jack Keane and David Petraeus, also a general, are trying to normalize the use of tactical nukes in some of their commentary on the legacy news talking head shows. So this is very scary to me. And thank goodness we have Colonel Macgregor back to open up a discussion about that. And this is a guy, he's got to be the least popular military guy in DC. He probably doesn't get invited to very good cocktail parties because he is fighting linguistically a war against the propaganda that is driven by people who get these cushy, inside DC, people who get these cushy jobs with Raytheon and the other weapons manufacturers. And they are the ones who actually benefit from this, don't they? They're the ones, the Ukrainian people are not benefiting from there not being a peace agreement in this. No, they are not. And lots of European people are struggling now because of the hardships being driven by the way this war is being prosecuted and the sanctions, etc. So Douglas Macgregor, yes, we're going to get there very soon. I'm not going to talk a lot today so we can get to him. And then our second guest, I'm also really happy to have her on. Her name is Ava Bartlett. She is a Canadian/American independent reporter who covers Ukraine from the Russian area. It's called the Donbass, where they just had voting. She will blow the lid off of the propaganda around that voting and those, they weren't really elections, it was a referendum on what the people there wanted to do. And also some of the other fallacies about the war. She's the real deal. She won the Martha Gellhorn Prize for foreign reporting, and she takes a lot of risks. And you will actually hear during our interview with Eva the shells coming in and going out. It's really astonishing. I was quite upset by what I was hearing. They were landing very close to her, and she just kept talking about what she was seeing for our interview. So stick around. We're going to do Colonel Douglas Macgregor first and then Eva Bartlett second. The other reason that we are re-recording today is to timestamp this. So this is Friday morning. This is the day that our show normally drops. So things have happened in the past 48 hours, and they may happen between the time we record this at 10:45 and when it drops at around 7:30 p.m. So it is October the 7th, and it is 10:45 in the morning in this very fast moving story. So we are time-stamped. The other piece of interesting information that General Macgregor talks about today is the idea that Zelensky was talking about building a dirty nuclear bomb as a response. So we're in deep, deep trouble, people, and we need to be thinking clearly about this. And the only thing that matters now is ending this thing as quickly and cleanly as possible. We know that there were talks in April between Zelensky and Moscow, and that they were shut down by the Biden administration. This is not good. So please stick around and listen to the interviews today. And I hope they help enlighten you, given that what you're hearing from legacy media is primarily not true, sadly, as it is in most of the war reporting and all of the other issues that we are dealing with today. We cannot count on them. So I'm going to do my pitch now. And the pitch is simply that we count on you for our continued existence here at Trish Wood is Critical. We're so grateful for the people who pledge and help us keep the lights on. It's not just me, but we have audio producers we pay. I have an editorial assistant named Dorothea who is wonderful and helps me pull these shows together. So your donations and support are greatly, greatly appreciated by everybody here. We're staying independent so that we don't have to, in any way, shape, or form, doctor what we say to you. I can say on this show whatever I want. Now, the people who are our funding platforms, namely Patreon and PayPal, are tricky now. So you can go to Patreon, you can go to PayPal, you can find them by linking on the button at my website, which is trishwoodpodcast.com. But we are slowly but surely moving everybody over to Substack, because Substack is a dedicated free speech platform, and we don't have to worry about being censored in any way. So please consider doing that. We would be grateful. Also, if you like our show, do tell your friends and neighbors and family about it. Send them a link to a show you like, and let's see if we can keep building our audience. It is growing slowly but surely, and we're also grateful for that. I will be appearing at the Free Speech and Medicine Conference in Burdeck, Nova Scotia at the end of the month. Please go to the website, freespeechandmedicine.com. It's being put on by Doctors Chris Milburn and his wife, Julie Kerwin, also a doctor. They write the Substack called Pair O Docs. And it's a very, very important event. Jay Bhattacharya is going to be there, and many, many other bright voices from COVID. And that's a connection that you can make here, right? Like, the legacy media doesn't go for making a complete hash of COVID, which they did, full of distortions, outright lies, and then trying to censor the people who are getting it right, like us, right? And then all of a sudden they are playing it straight on Ukraine. That's not happening. You can expect all the same stuff is going on around how they are covering the Ukraine conflict with Russia, Russia's conflict with Ukraine, and it's all being stirred in this dangerous little pot with the hands of the U.S. State Department and Toria Nuland, and also Lindsey Graham is right in on this too. He was over in the Ukraine causing trouble with John McCain. You know, Ukraine is a client state. The idea that this is a perfectly free country and that there was no skullduggery underway before the Russians attacked it's ludicrous and not true. And we've had many guests on discussing those issues as well for you. So I'm going to lead the show today with my discussion recorded yesterday with Colonel Doug Macgregor. Hi, Colonel. How are you?
Very well, thanks.
Good. I'm not so good. I'm feeling quite anxious, actually, about the developments in the last 2 weeks. I can't make sense of them because they feel kind of nihilistic and self-destructive. But but I do rely on you to sort me out on this stuff. So I guess I'll start off by asking you about the two kind of big newsworthy events, although there are many. Well, and then one just happened too, that OPEC said they were cutting back oil a few minutes ago. So I don't know what that means. But tell me, what is your sense of the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline? What is your view about what happened there?
Well, as I'm sure you're aware, a lot of people have been asking me that question, and I have to tell everyone that at the moment, I do not have all the facts. And so the best I can do is speculate on the basis of who likely benefits from the damage to the pipeline versus who suffers. And when you look at the who benefits, that leads you to certain conclusions. And then you have to ask the question, who has the capability to do such a thing? And that narrows the field even more. So I would say if you ask who's got the capabilities, well, clearly in the area, the Royal Navy, the United States Navy, and their respective special operations forces, they definitely have the capability. The Poles, simply because of the proximity of their shipyards and facilities, could play a role in this, but it's unlikely they could have done it on their own. And the only other Navy in the world that springs to mind that could have done something is the Japanese Navy, but I doubt they were in the Baltic. So I think that's where we are. And the interesting news just received a few minutes ago is from a German source is that the Germans have concluded that the damage can actually be repaired, that it is not so serious that, the pipeline is permanently out of action. Now, whether or not that turns out to be true, I don't know.
Yeah.
But the German spokesman, and I presume he's in Berlin, but he could be somewhere else, made the comment that they were already talking to other partners about affecting repairs. So we'll see how that goes, if that turns out to be accurate or not.
You obviously know about this funny little tweet that came from, I believe he was a Polish member of the European government, saying thank you USA or something along those lines, and showing a photograph of the thing bubbling up in the ocean. I mean, I thought, what games are being played here? You know, on one hand, they're saying, America's saying we didn't do it. You've got Poland, who's kind of itching for a fight, thanking them. I mean, what did you make of that tweet?
Well, this was the former Polish foreign minister, Sikorski.
Yes, yes.
He's married to Anne Applebaum, who is a very prominent neocon, an advocate for war with Russia and regime change in Moscow. So it's not surprising that he made that comment. Is it true? Again, I don't know. It could be. But again, he may also have concluded, based upon whatever his wife told him, that we had a role in this because we seem to have been interested in preventing Germany and other Central European states from benefiting from cheap Russian natural gas in order to ensure that Germany in particular stays on side against Russia, something that, frankly, the government in Berlin has never been comfortable with.
And so obviously, when you're looking at an event like this, as they do when police are investigating a crime, right, they say who benefits from it. So who benefits from this pipeline being out of service? Because it seems to me if when people are saying Russia, they could just turn the gas off rather than blowing up their own pipeline, right? So
of course, absolutely.
So who benefits from this?
Well, the assumption is that the United States wants to ensure that under no circumstances will the Germans cooperate with the Russians on anything. So one assumes that for that reason alone, whatever you can do to prevent Germany from receiving natural gas is part of it. Then we also have to note that within 24 hours of the pipeline damage, a pipeline from Norway to Poland began operating, pumping natural gas to Poland. Of course, natural gas from Norway is infinitely more expensive than the natural gas from Russia. And that's one of the reasons everybody wanted to use Russian natural gas, because it's very inexpensive.
Yeah.
And have to keep in mind that Germany really is the scientific industrial giant in Europe, and probably one of the top 4 in the world in terms of chemical industries, heavy industries, steel, manufacturing of all sorts of machine tools. Natural gas is a vital component of all of that. Then on top of that, you've got the agricultural dimension. Germany, the Netherlands, Denmark, very productive agrarian sectors. And the fertilizers that come along with the natural gas from Russia are equally important. Right now, farmers cannot maintain the food that they've grown because they can't power the greenhouses and freezing facilities that they normally use. So the whole agricultural sector is crashing, and the defense scientific industrial sector is crashing, particularly in Germany, because they don't have the cheap natural gas to operate. So who benefits from that? Well, the Norwegians obviously seem to bear ill will for Germany and others. Mm-hmm. They're profiting from this, but they've already made it clear to the British and others that they don't have enough energy to share with Great Britain, that is headed into a very dangerous winter right now. So somebody is benefiting besides Norway. Presumably the United States thinks that it can sell liquefied natural gas. The problem is moving it. There are very few ships built to move liquefied natural gas. And at the moment, Germany does not have an LNG terminal to receive it. So I don't know how that's going to work out.
Is there thinking amongst the smart people like you that if America did do this, that part of the logic behind it would be to purposely escalate the tensions because they're interested in escalating the fight with, well, Ukraine, but in the end, Russia? Is it a provocation, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Trish, the problem with this is that technically, if the Russians decided to do so, they could regard this damage to their pipeline as an act of war.
Right.
And if they trace it back to the United States, then that would justify war with the United States. But Mr. Putin, at least as far as I can tell over the last 20 plus years, has done everything in his power to avoid that.
Yeah.
And of course, while Mr. Trump was in office, there was a lot of cooperation on the military side and intelligence side between Russia and the United States. Russians cooperated with us in Afghanistan. They cooperated with us in Syria on numerous occasions. They provided us with extremely valuable intelligence on the Islamist threat, terrorist networks, worked with us on that score. And Trump made it abundantly clear that he did not want to treat Russia as an enemy, which was very unpopular in Washington, not necessarily with the American people. I don't think most Americans really understand the complexity of this whole problem, but large numbers of Americans, if you ask them, would probably readily tell you that they have no interest in war with Russia. So the people who are most interested in war with Russia all seem to be concentrated in Washington, D.C., perhaps some in the financial markets in New York City. And obviously, since many of the people that are dominant in the financial markets also own the media and are also controlling much of Congress, because of their campaign donations and so forth, have an interest in this sort of thing. But once you move out of those circles, there's really no appetite in the United States for war, any more than I suspect there is in Canada. And clearly, Mr. Trudeau in Canada has been vociferous in his attacks on the Russians, which I think are ridiculous, but that's my own opinion.
Well, and you know what's interesting for us watching this play out in our prime ministers, I mean, I just believe that he's an influenced globalist now. But, back in the day, we were known for staying out of Vietnam and, doing peacekeeping. We were known for staying out of Iraq because the Canadian public had no appetite for those conflicts. And the Canadian, we always try to feel that we're somewhat more reluctant to get into these type of conflicts, but something's changed here. And I believe it is because of the globalist movement, right? That Trudeau's, fealty is to that ideology rather than representing what Canadians actually feel. But I also feel in saying that some Canadians are sort of captured by this ideology too, and they've put the Ukraine flags up. And that means that we have to fight to the bitter end to rescue this country from the narrative that's being spun, right? I think it's really changed us.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that, although I'm not surprised. To remember Harold Macmillan, who was, in my judgment, a very fine prime minister for Great Britain, one of the last really good prime ministers with an understanding of the world, made it abundantly clear to President Kennedy in private during the Cuban Missile Crisis that Britain, under no circumstances, would support an intervention in Vietnam.
Yeah.
And if the United States went in there, it would not go in with British support. And I recall very vividly at the time, in my own family, people made the observations that thank God for the British, they're a voice of reason. Well, that voice of reason is also silenced. And you have people now in London, in Washington, in Ottawa, who are all committed to this globalist cause. Now, I think you have to look at the World Economic Forum. You have to look at who's a member.
Yeah.
Then you have to look at money flows. And we have our own set of oligarchs in the West, like Mr. Soros, who have actively funded the globalist movement, which involves open borders, green energy, the effective destruction of our scientific industrial capacity, and so forth, the denationalization of states.
Yeah.
So all of this is bound up with the war against Putin, because he's led the fight against denationalization, against U.S. dollar-dominated operations and global finance that is aimed at essentially controlling his country. He's made that abundantly clear. He's now has on side with him and support, obviously, the Chinese, the Indians, the Brazilians, large number, most people, frankly, in Southeast Asia. The Japanese really are unhappy with what's going on because this whole process is destroying their economy. They want nothing to do with it, and they have a very precarious debt to GDP ratio as we do. So I think the world in general is not supportive of this. This little globalist club is limited to North America and Western Europe largely, and there are other unwilling participants inside the European Union and NATO, which is why back in January, when I was first asked about whether or not the Russians would go in, and I said they would, and they said, what's the outcome? I said, I don't think NATO will survive this, because interests are different everywhere. You know, George Washington was approached by Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson thought that we should join the French Revolution and support them. He said, after all, the French supported us. And his comment was, well, no, the King of France supported us, not the French Revolution. And he said, no, but we need to be part of this global revolution. And he said, we can't do it. And he said, no country can be expected to move beyond the limits of its own interests. Well, I think we and you and Britain and many other states in Europe have already moved beyond our own interests.
Absolutely.
We had no interest in determining who would control Eastern Ukraine. We had no interest in this conflict at all. We have no interest in destroying Russia's economy or anyone else's economy. The one interest we had, as President Trump pointed out, was in bringing this to a very rapid close. And the thing that I expected, and everybody that had, in my judgment, any understanding of world events expected, was that Biden and his administration would behave like every Washington administration had since Eisenhower, and that is to move quickly to put an end to conflict that involved Russia and Europe.
Yeah. I think one of the reasons I'm feeling anxiety, and certainly many people I know are feeling a lot of anxiety about the nukes angle of this, including somebody who said to me on the phone the other day, do I need a go bag? Like, do I need to race to the country at some point? Is that what's happening now? Which seems like hyperbole, but actually it's not, right? I mean, here's what's troubling for me, amongst many troubling things, is that people like, maybe they're friends of yours, but General Keane and David Petraeus, in interviews on legacy media, are normalizing now in conversation the use of the use of limited nukes. And I just kind of feel like I've been transported to another planet in listening to these people talk that way. Is that why are they doing that?
Well, you have to, in the case of Petraeus and Keane, and by the way, neither of these men are friends of mine. I mean, I know them and they know me, and we are 180 degrees apart from each other in terms of our views.
Yeah.
but you have to understand who is paying them. And when I say paying them, it's not as though you're on a standard payroll, but look at the financial firms that they joined after leaving the military in New York City. Look at the people that the candidates that those firms support. Those candidates are people like Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, Joseph Biden, and so forth. They also are now multimillionaires as a result of being rewarded for their support and involvement in the execution of these interventions, not just in Iraq and Afghanistan, but also in Libya and elsewhere. So they're part of a larger group that I was trying to explain earlier when I talked about Washington, New York, and the media. They're part of that complex, and they're actively saying these things. Now, the notion of a limited nuclear war is absurd. Anyone with any sense at all has understood that now for 70 years. It's an impossibility. There's no such animal. The notion that there is a tactical nuclear weapon is equally misleading. As a friend of mine says, "Oh, Doug, we'll just use a tactical nuclear weapon and that'll signal our position." And I said, well, if you're sitting in Moscow or Beijing or any number of places and suddenly a low yield nuclear weapon, which means 5 kilotons or less, explodes in the country next to you, in this case, Ukraine, and kills several thousand of your troops and destroys a lot of infrastructure, no one is going to say, oh, well, let's not get too excited. That was a small nuclear detonation. Yeah. In fact, what they'll do is say, look, we better use our arsenal and launch a first strike before we lose it. And everyone has always known that. So first of all, there is no evidence that Vladimir Putin has any interest whatsoever in using nuclear weapons. Quite the contrary. He's made it very clear on numerous occasions that weapon is purely a retaliatory weapon in the event that his country is directly attacked by another state and that state uses a nuclear weapon. Otherwise, it's off the table. Secondly, no one in their right mind is going to use a nuclear weapon on their doorstep. And the Israelis, for instance, are armed with nuclear weapons. Would they use a nuclear weapon on the Golan Heights? Absolutely not. Would they use it immediately next door on the ground in Syria or Jordan? Out of the question. I mean, that's just lunacy. We would not use a nuclear weapon on the border between Mexico and Texas. Absurd. So this is all nonsense. And I think it's designed to scare the American people in the hope that the American people will be more supportive of what's happening in Ukraine. I don't think it works. I think it's counterproductive, and I think it's dangerous.
Yeah. So let's talk, given how corrupt, I guess is the best way to put it, legacy media is in the way they cover the story. We know we can't trust them. What is happening actually, in your view, on the ground? Because we're hearing that they're losing places, they're winning places. We're hearing that the voting in Donbass was not legit. I mean, where do we actually stand now?
Well, I think you have to go to alternative media sources, and you have to listen to various accounts to reach any sort of reasonable conclusion. First of all, I really think that these referenda that were conducted were legitimate. People forget the area where the Russian forces are currently sitting were, in fact, already Russian. And one of the problems they had when they first went in, when the Russian army did, right now the Russian army is largely elsewhere. It is not in southern Ukraine. These are militia forces, the Chechen forces, the Wagner mercenary groups, volunteer organizations from the Kuban Cossacks and other places. Very good fighters, by the way. Much, much better than what we would call the National Guard. But they are running an economy of force operation in southern Ukraine. They are essentially placeholders because the regular army was pulled back to refit, reorganize, re-equip. I thought they might attack in force in August, but for various reasons that was delayed. And I don't think you're going to see a major Russian offensive to terminate this conflict until really November, when the ground freezes, because that's a precondition for Russian maneuver forces. Second, I think people need to understand that when they say, well, there's an offensive. Okay, there's an offensive. And what do you have? You have usually on the scale of 30 or 40,000 Ukrainian troops committed against perhaps 4,000 of these Russians. And the Russians, of course, are backed up by large numbers of regular army artillery and rocket fire and missiles and Air Force. And what they have been told is, you do not have to request permission if you deem it wise to withdraw to a more defensible position. You make those decisions on your own. The only thing that you're being asked to do right now is inflict as much damage as possible on the attacking Ukrainians, which they're doing, and defend the territory to the best of your ability. So when they say, well, we've had great success in this offensive, you're usually talking about an advance of perhaps 20 kilometers across fairly open, rolling terrain, and the withdrawal of Russian forces to a subsequent defensive position, which gives them better fields of fire and allows them to inflict more damage on the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have probably taken 100,000 dead. There may be 200,000 or 300,000 or more wounded. Again, we have to speculate. We don't have data, and anything that comes out of Kiev has to be dismissed out of hand as untrue.
Yeah.
And the Russians don't really know in great detail how many they've killed or wounded. They just know that the losses taken by the Ukrainians are enormous. And they're down to very few armored fighting vehicles. In fact, they just received 250 T-72s from two former Warsaw Pact countries. And that's probably all that they have for a tank force that's left. And how they're going to use that is anybody's guess. There was a claim made last night that 50,000 Ukrainian troops are part of a larger offensive that were all trained in England by the British Army. What we're hearing now is that number is probably no greater than 30,000. It may be much less. And that means that they're probably the only ones out of a force of, say, 100,000 who have very much formal training.
Yeah.
So the situation in Kiev is very desperate. And then the final point is that Mr. Zelensky has been saying a lot of things that reflect this desperation. He let it slip to the Ukrainian media that he had directed a group of scientists and engineers to work on building a quote unquote dirty nuclear bomb. Well, they were going to use spent uranium fuel from one of the nuclear power plants because they don't have weapons grade uranium. That is, they don't have plutonium. But with spent uranium fuel, you could certainly do damage, but it takes time to build that, and then you've got to deliver it. Those are not easy tasks, but he's let these kinds of things slip. I think it's a measure of just how very desperate he is. Everybody keeps talking about Putin being desperate. I can't find any evidence for it. Just as they say, well, 100,000 Russian men have left the country to avoid being drafted. Well, first of all, there is no draft. They just brought, per se, about 134,000 were already admitted to the Russian army this year. That's a draft segment that happens annually. But most of the troops are professional. And in this case, these are 300,000 reservists who are being used largely to relieve Russian forces in other parts of Russia so that they could be concentrated in the West and in Belarus. So I think Mr. Putin is actually in pretty good shape. Their economy is doing very well.
Yeah.
There is no food shortage. There is no shortage of fuel, and there's no lack of ammunition or armored fighting vehicles or anything else. So I think it's Mr. Zelensky who's quite desperate, and this is almost his last gasp right now with these counteroffensives that are bleeding the Ukrainians badly and are not really gaining anything strategically for Ukraine.
Well, I don't know if you saw it. I'm sure you did. There's a video of him signing this NATO document, to get entry into NATO. He's got these two kind of thuggish looking, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they look like wrestlers or something beside him. They're all wearing camo green. And so it was just ridiculous. Like he does the big flourish. It's like, how more kind of provocative can he be? Like, wait, I didn't understand what that was in service of, except to kind of keep the information flow in his favor as this, Churchillian kind of character who's fighting off the forces of evil. It just seemed unnecessary.
Well,
dangerous.
I don't recall Sir Winston Churchill posing for a photo opportunity with thuggish-looking British soldiers.
Yeah. I mean, it's
somebody was talking to me about Biden, who spoke in Philadelphia in this very weird setting with red lights and these two Marines in the shadows. And I said to somebody, well, I'm not a Democrat, and I wasn't alive when FDR was there. Don't necessarily think he was great for the country, but FDR had fireside chats. Hardly the Biden approach.
Yeah.
So there's something very bewildering about all of this.
It is bewildering. I don't understand it. None of it makes sense to me. And I've been doing this for 40 years. And I guess that's what my anxiety is about too, because I have a very devoted audience of people who love to come to the show and hear some good old-fashioned critical thinking. Some of them are mad at me because I'm not buying into the legacy media line on Ukraine, even though I was around for weapons of mass destruction. I was working as a journalist then, I remember how everybody gets things wrong. And yet it's kind of like Lucy and Charlie Brown in the football. Charlie always thinks she's not going to pull it away, and she always does. And that's been my experience with legacy media and covering, issues of war. I want to ask you a couple of things specifically about where we are. So we have this escalating rhetoric between the three sides, if you want to look at it that way: Russia, Ukraine, and then, of course, Washington. Are there people in the European Union, in NATO, who are doing back channel discussions with the Biden administration saying, we don't want this, tone it down? Would that be happening as far as you know?
I'm sure there are exchanges like that because they always happen. When I was on active duty, the people that were most supportive of the Kosovo air campaign were people like the Norwegians or the English, who were remote from the scene of action.
Right.
The Italians, the Greeks, the Bulgarians, Romanians, the Hungarians, everybody else was very uncomfortable with what was going on because they understood how fragile the conditions in the Balkans were and how this could lead to a wider war that might even include Russia.
Yeah.
We managed to keep them on side, and we ultimately negotiated a deal with Moscow, in which we promised Moscow, which at the time was governed by Mr. Yeltsin, all sorts of things that I can't go into, that most of which I doubt were ever delivered, in return for their informing Milosevic that they could not guarantee support for him through the coming winter. That was the reason that Milosevic threw in the towel, because what he was most concerned about was food and fuel for the Balkan winter. When it became clear he wasn't going to get that, he said, I've got to cut our losses and pull out. So these kinds of things do happen. And historically, we've paid a lot more attention to what our major allies thought than we do today. I think there has been a tendency to treat the European states not quite as vassal states, but certainly as military dependencies who are expected to show up and do what they were told. And I think that's going to end as a result of this, which should end, particularly in Germany. Will
NATO survive it, do you think?
I think it's going to be tough. Imagine you are a German citizen, and I've got emails from friends in Germany, and they're telling me that now wood has become gold in Germany. Ugh. And Germans are going into the forest to chop down trees and get wood to heat themselves. You've got to understand something. I lived in Germany for almost off and on for 8 years of my life. I went there as an exchange student in 1969. I first visited there in 68. And I can tell you that the Germans probably, this is long before anybody thought about ecology or the green movement, really worship trees. If you're trying to move a tree, they keep their forests, or used to, the way you would keep your garden. Yeah. The forests were immaculate. The farmers and country people went in there twice a year to clean out everything, so you never had forest fires. They were acutely sensitive to watersheds, and no one would remove a tree without permission practically from Berlin. So for the Germans to be doing that, things are bad. I know they can't get cooking oil. I know that the shelves in many stores and shops are empty. People are genuinely worried about food shortages. And as one German pointed out, who's dead now to me many years ago, all through World War II until the very end of the war, everybody inside the greater German empire ate. No one starved. And that was because of the experience with the British blockade during World War I. So now you're dealing with a government that is a parliamentary democracy, that is part of an alliance of states that we regard as Western liberal political systems. And suddenly the Germans are facing the high probability of thousands of people dying for lack of heat, the lack of food, the lack of medicines, the lack of all sorts of things that they had taken for granted. Now, would you stay in an alliance led by the United States that produced that outcome in your country?
Yeah, I mean, it's shocking. So I know you got to go. So let's wrap up with a couple of questions. I want to talk to you about why no negotiations, but I also want to hear your kind of your intel and your theory about what then the agenda of the United States and the State Department and Blinken and Sullivan and Tory and Newland and all those people really is now. Do they want a war? Do they actually want a real hot war with Russia? Is that what they want?
Well, I don't think they do. I don't think, however, that there was ever any coherent strategy. We are governed at the moment by ideologues. These are not people that approach international relations on the basis of understood interests. You know, you'll regard or refer to the European past. The question was, what is Paris's interest? What is the interest that Vienna has? What is the interest that Moscow has? There is no interest in interests. This is an ideological war waged by the globalists who are neocons and other things, committed to the ruin and destruction of a government and a state that stands in their minds in the way of their globalist revolution and conquest. That's all. And so whenever you would ask the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, or anybody, what is your goal? Our goal is to harm Russia.
Yeah.
And then say, well, what do you mean by that? Well, make sure they can never do this again. Well, wait a minute. They're reacting to something that we did. Well, if we don't do this, they'll try to reconquer Eastern Europe. Well, you just said that the Russian forces are small. They're hardly the danger that you originally thought they were. So how can they threaten Eastern Europe when they seem to be struggling according to you, against Ukraine? You understand? These are the contradictions that people are thinking and hearing, but you never hear that from a journalist in the West. Those things never come up. But anybody with a brain asks those questions. So first, there is no strategy. We have a group of ideologues, and they don't regard any interest that may be articulated in Moscow as legitimate. For that matter, they don't give a damn what anybody in Berlin, London, or anywhere else thinks. They expect everyone to get in line and help destroy this holdout against their programs of denationalization, financial domination, globalism, and so forth.
It always shocks me how easy it is if you demonize an opponent the way that they do in the legacy media in the States. And I obviously, the neocons know this, how people will fall in line. I was looking for more information. I try to read whatever is written. I found this guy named Timothy Snyder at Yale, who's got a new piece in Foreign Affairs. My hair is on fire. It was so bizarre. And he's like a big deal, right?
Well, these are the people that dominate academia in the United States and in most of the West. They preach doctrines that are based, I think, on a very false narrative about the past. I was trying to explain to someone, I'm sure there are many of your listeners that are in a similar position. My maternal grandfather fought in the First World War, and he and his entire class from the University of Pennsylvania enlisted and went to fight, and he went in as a private, came back as a first lieutenant in 1920. But, he pointed out we lost 318,000 we had 318,000 casualties. He said we had 110,000 dead. The United States Army and armed forces on the ground in France only fought for 110 days. He said, Douglas, that's 1,000 dead Americans in every battle. Oh. And he said, when it was over, we were trying to understand what it was that we fought for. And he said, as we looked around, we saw a lot of evidence that we were rescuing the French from certain defeat, and the British weren't far behind, and they were all imperialists, and we Americans were not. And the best people I met and talked to on the battlefield were Germans. And he said, we all came back from this and said, what were we doing over there killing Germans? What was the point? What were we trying to achieve? Where was this great democratic revolution? Where was the war to end all wars? It's all nonsense. And so years later, in the 1960s, when I was a teenager, there would be fights in the family about what was happening in Vietnam. And my mother would say, but Daddy, we have to support the troops. And he would become angry. And he said, if you support the troops, get them out of Vietnam.
Yeah.
I never forgot that.
Your dad is what a wise guy. I mean, it's like love the troops, hate the war or something like that.
Well, he was my grandfather, but I never forgot that.
Yeah.
And that's why when I looked at these things, certainly since 2003, when I was asked to come in and plan the advance on Baghdad, everyone told me, we're not going to stay. We're going to go in there. We're going to install a new government. We're going to pull out. And I thought, well, that's reasonable because everybody who's ever stayed has regretted it. It's a waste of time.
Yeah.
But, none of it happened. Everything was a lie. And I think Americans are beginning to get this. I really do. But it's a long, hard slog because people are too ready to believe whatever comes through the television or the radio without first saying, well, wait a minute, who's telling me this? And who do they work for? And why are they saying it? And that's what you have to ask with people like Petraeus and Keene and others.
Well, I think the most dangerous thing, well, there are many dangerous things, but one of the dangerous things right now is that the left, which under normal circumstances is kind of out there asking, or was out there asking hard questions, is now so devoted to the Democratic Party that they're kind of blindly supporting this. So there are all these really strange political alignments right now that make me very nervous. But let me ask my last question, because I know you got to run. Give me a quick answer on all the stuff, the money, the weapon systems, everything that's being sent to Ukraine. What's actually happening with it in your view? Where's it going?
Well, somebody told me recently that the total amount of alleged aid is $69 billion.
Wow.
But the vast majority of the cash never leaves the United States. The cash is simply moved from the Hill after the Treasury prints it at the direction of the Congress.
Yeah.
And then that cash goes to the Pentagon to pay for the equipment that is taken out of war stocks and shipped to Ukraine. Then that same bundle of cash is transferred to the defense industries, who are being asked to replenish the stocks that were just depleted through shipment to Ukraine. So it's kind of a shell game.
Wow.
Now, that doesn't mean that we haven't shipped money over there, because we know we're effectively paying for the Ukrainian government, its bureaucracy, its military, its soldiers, its leadership. All of that is American cash. But that's minuscule compared with the billions for the weapon systems and the ammunition.
Wow.
Now, once it gets into the country, I'm told that, you're lucky to see 40% or 50% of that equipment ultimately reach the front because of the widespread corruption inside Ukraine, which is one of the most corrupt countries in the world. It's the leader in Europe and one of the leaders in the world in terms of human trafficking, especially involving women and children. And it leads in pornography and a whole number of different areas. This is hardly the pristine liberal democracy that's being portrayed. But the worst part is that the Ukrainian people are being exploited by us in a proxy war. And I think proxy wars are fundamentally immoral. If you're not willing to fight the war yourself, what gives you the right morally to expect someone else to die in your cause?
Well, that's the big moral question surrounding this whole event for me, and I'm so glad you posed it, albeit rhetorically. I hope people are listening to the question, because I don't understand why it's okay to keep pushing and escalating when lots of innocent people are dying, and the outcome is very likely going to be not what they want it to be, correct?
Oh, the Russians are going to be the big winners in this contest, unfortunately. And everything that we have known for 50, 60, 70 years is going to change as a result of this reckless policy.
Oh, goodness. Okay, Colonel Macgregor, I am so glad to have you on. I really appreciate your straight talking. I know you got to run, but thanks for making some time for us today. Have a good day.
Thank you. God bless.
Thanks, Colonel. Bye. That was Colonel Douglas Macgregor. And now we're going to move to our next segment with independent reporter Eva Bartlett, who we reached in the Donbass region. And you can actually, as I said, you can hear the shelling behind her. She's a very interesting young woman who has covered many conflicts in the world. But what I want to say to you about her before we hear her is that she is an award-winning journalist. She's taken seriously by very many people around the world. And she did win the Martha Gellhorn Prize. And she was also the subject of a bit of a smear that was carried on the CBC, put together by a guy named Justin Ling, who was talking about the usual misinformation and disinformation. There's a whole bunch of reporters, to use a word that Justin Ling uses all the time, peddling this stuff. If people are not towing the narrative party line, they can be subject to this kind of reporting in quotation marks. She was accused by Justin Ling and someone he contacted from a think tank in the States that if you look at who's funding it, it is a neocon, Gatesian, established order think tank. It is not a place where you will find independent thought of any kind. So it was quite unfair to have someone like that on criticizing Eva Bartlett. And it would be great if they actually criticized her reporting and offered, where she went wrong, but they don't do that when these things happen. So that's kind of an embarrassment for CBC. I do say this to her. And what I say to her also is that back in the day when I was at As It Happens, she is a person we would have booked to come on that show. That is absolutely true. We were always looking for the independent voices on the international conflicts because the legacy media, even back then, were not that great at covering them. So here is the CBC today now smearing someone, and it really feels like a smear, who is doing great work. So here is my interview with Eva Bartlett from Donetsk in Donbass. Hi, how are you?
I'm doing fine, thank you.
Tell me where you are.
I am in Donetsk, in the Donetsk People's Republic.
Okay, and that's just for people who haven't been following too closely. That's the eastern part of Ukraine, and that is the part that is garnering a lot of controversy. They just had a vote. It's primarily Russian speakers who, as I understand it, feel an allegiance with Russia. Is that correct?
Yep, absolutely. And we can get into in more detail the referendum that occurred from September 23rd to 27th.
Okay, good. So I guess what I want to find out, first of all, just as someone who is obviously on the other side of the world, and I'm a person who, having been at CBC for quite a while and doing a lot of foreign stories, I have so very much respect for people who actually go to the place where the news is happening now, instead of doing it over a laptop. What is it like today where you are? What is the sense of what's happening in that part of the country? Just sort of generally speaking, and I guess really on a human level.
Okay, well, so as I mentioned, I'm in Donetsk. So if people aren't aware, that is the capital of the Donetsk People's Republic. And this is a war zone. So you will be hearing sounds of incoming and outgoing explosions. The outgoing will probably sound louder unless an incoming comes close to the apartment I'm renting. Right. I woke up at 2 a.m. to the sound of both incoming and outgoing. Mm-hmm. So I'm not as rested as I want to be. But in any case, I'll be getting into more of Ukraine's attacks on the center of Donetsk, because while I've said this is a war zone, there's no military infrastructure in Donetsk, in the center where Ukraine attacks.
Right.
Yet Ukraine has been attacking relentlessly, not every single day in the center, but frequently enough that I've experienced it quite a lot.
Are you in danger, Eva?
Yes, I mean, I think I figured out the position of the apartment I'm renting is facing south, so maybe less danger at the very moment. But if I go out and walk on the street, anybody here is at danger because, like I said, Ukraine has been shelling the center of Donetsk. So even if I'm wearing a flak jacket and helmet, the kind of artillery, and I'm not a weapons expert, but I've come to get to be a bit familiar with some of it. They're firing 155 millimeter artillery, which is very precise, but also is designed to fragment into quite a lot of shrapnel. And that's where it gets quite deadly, particularly if you're an average person walking on the street or your grandmother selling flowers or whatever, and you have no warning, and suddenly a shell lands and you're shredded with shrapnel, as has happened many times here, many being an understatement. So yeah, it's a risk being here for sure.
And it's interesting that you would say, is that shelling?
That would be outgoing.
So we're actually hearing it right now.
Yeah. That's
Wow.
that's what I woke up to. Also, I heard incoming. And
Wow.
yesterday I traveled with two other journalists and one of their translators to the northern village of Gorlivka, and that's a village that's been incredibly hard hit since 2014. Which is another important point I forgot to emphasize, that this did not start in February here. This has been going on since 2014. And in this village of Gorlivka, because it is closer to Ukrainian forces, I guess in the south for Ukraine, the north for the DPR, it's been extremely hard hit, including, again, the city center, but also periphery villages have been targeted heavily. Something I saw when I came here for my first time in 2019 and visited some of these villages. So yesterday I went back with two journalists to one of the villages I had visited and another, and they're like ghost towns because the shelling has been so intense. In the second one, Zaitsevo, when I visited in 2019, the then head of that village said the houses were being destroyed house by house, street by street, and there was a house that was still smoldering from an attack 2 days prior. I didn't go deep into the heart of that town yesterday, but I did go into another one. I'd have to look at my notes to get the pronunciation for that, and met with a number of locals, mostly elderly, that were staying there. In the center of the town, I tried to interview people. I did interview one man, but a woman I stopped and asked if I could interview her said no, not because she didn't want to talk to me, but she didn't want to stay in the town center because she said it was so heavily, well, she didn't say, but I was told it's so heavily shelled that nobody wants to spend more time there than they absolutely have to.
You know what you're, excuse me. First of all, let me just say, I hope you're not near a window. And if you need to move, let us know and we'll make time for that. But, one of the things as listening to you that it reminds me of is that people think modern warfare is still about shooting and bang bang, and it's really not. It's about explosions, isn't it? Isn't that what happens to people in these places, that it's about body parts, it's about loud noises, it's about things coming from nowhere that you can't kind of protect against, and that brings with it a certain kind of trauma, doesn't it?
Well, mentioning the loud noises. So even if you haven't been maimed or killed by, one of the various types of artillery Ukraine is sending, there's still the psychological trauma, knowing at any time this could be your last moment, and the constant sound, even including outgoing, but of incoming, it is psychologically damaging. People become very accustomed to it because they've been living with it for over 8 years. So you'll see, I'm sure you've already seen this, you'll see videos of a reporter, for example, interviewing some citizen here, and when the incoming lands, they don't flinch. But the reporter does, right? Because although, of course, a lot of reporters are very experienced, but some flinch, some don't. But the locals just generally don't, because they're just so accustomed to it. Of course, that's not healthy, but it is what it is, right?
Yeah, well, that's sad in its own way, isn't it? That they've kind of adapted to it. It's awful, really.
Yeah.
And the other thing you're saying, because I want to guide people into this rather gently, and that is this: that you are talking about Ukraine shelling these people. And that is a story that is not being told in the approved news media narrative right now, which is that everything bad happening in Ukraine is being done by Russians, and that the Ukraine forces are this kind of ragtag bunch of people fighting for democracy. I mean, that's really the narrative right now, and that's why it's so upsetting to hear the truth, or to hear the truth and what you're witnessing there, because it's not reported in legacy media.
Yeah, well, thank you. I don't even know the extent of how much Canada alone has funded Ukraine. I know Radio Canada had a report some months ago saying it was $1 billion. Somebody else said it's probably triple that amount, but I can't confirm that. But nonetheless, Western nations are funding Ukraine, have been funding Ukraine for years, and sending them, the weapons, not all of them, but some of the weapons that are being used to slaughter and maim people here. And as for, like you said, this image of them being a ragtag group, well, they've had training from the West, including from Canada. And there are, I don't know the numbers, but many foreign mercenaries fighting with them. And also they have the HIMARS, it's a much stronger type of missile system than, say, Grad missiles, and very precise as well. And those are being supplied by the West. And my understanding is also a certain degree, or quite a lot of training is being also supplied along with those HIMARS. So, it doesn't really, I know that legacy media, as you say, is portraying it as these valiant defenders, trying to take back their country or whatever, protect themselves against Russia. But it really is, when you go back to even 2014 and the coup d'etat that was orchestrated by the West, and then the rise of this extremist nationalism, not all Ukrainians, of course, but you can't deny, I mean, even the Globe and Mail, I believe, and maybe it was Ottawa Citizen, were until 2022 reporting on the fact that there are neo-Nazi groups in Ukraine, and they're prevalent. They're not just a random kind of thing. So no, it isn't a ragtag group of people. And back to their bombing. So I came back here. I came here in 2019, as I mentioned earlier, and then I came here in March, just briefly, at a Ministry of Defense delegation, which included Western journalists. I'm not a big fan of delegations, so then I just came back on my own after that, coming back for 3 weeks at a time since April. And then going back to my home in Moscow. And so I came back here on September 17th, and just as I was arriving back into Donetsk, the center of the city was being bombed. 4 people were killed, civilians, that day. I saw one of the bodies still on the ground in one of the areas, the very center of Donetsk. No military targets there. There's like an opera house. There's a main boulevard with a big public square that is usually filled with people passing by, whatever. That's where it was struck. 2 days later, September 19th, Ukraine bombed 2 different areas in the center of the city, killing 16 people. I went to the area where 10 people were killed at once. One died in the ambulance. 9 were killed in this particular district. The bodies and their parts were still there. It was a horrific. I've seen my share of dead bodies, unfortunately, over the many years, but it was a ghastly scene. I won't get too descriptive, but it was horrific.
Get descriptive.
Okay. There was a woman with just half of her torso, from her waist up. That's all that was left of her. There was a pile of bodies that I couldn't tell how many bodies they were, because they were just parts. There were parts of bodies like a hand, a foot, an ear. I mean, you saw splatters of blood. You saw chunks of flesh. You saw a chunk of something that could be a brain. I mean, and then there's the stench of death. I don't know if people realize how strong that stench is. And just seeing in this very small space, all these bodies, the bodies that were still intact, they were splayed in, whatever agonizing position they landed in. And you can find this on my YouTube. I had to blur it due to censorship. On my Odyssey and my Telegram, it's not blurred, so you can see the horrific, ghastly scenes for yourselves if you want to. And then some days later, on, I forget the date now, I want to say September 22nd, Ukrainian shelling, and this is all midday. This is all around noon. So they pick a busy time of day, a busy area, totally civilian area, no military, anything there. And that's where they bomb, because they're trying to inflict maximum damage on the people. So on September 22nd, they bombed about just near a marketplace I'd been the day prior, interviewing people. And that is about 700 meters from where I am currently. And that bombing killed 6 people. And again, there was a small city bus that was driving through at the time. It was burned out. There were 2 bodies inside. One was a young man, one was the driver. And there were at the time 4 other bodies on the ground, including 2 women, and I think the other 2 were men. I don't remember now. And body parts again all over. And this, I walk all over the city. I generally don't take taxis. I don't have my own vehicle. So I walk through that area all the time. There's a streetcar that runs along that street. There's a church in one direction. There's the market in the other direction. There is, as I've said before, grandmothers selling flowers on that street. It's just, it was a horrific scene. And the only reason, and it was again with 155 millimeter NATO caliber shells, very precise munitions. So there's no possible explanation that this was accidental. It was intentional on Ukraine's part.
Well, I guess I have a bunch of questions based on what you just said, but I guess the first one is, why is Ukraine shelling those people? What would they say? Would they deny they're doing it, or would they say we're doing it for a reason? How do we contextualize these events?
You will find both denial and bragging, actually. Denial probably in the media, certainly in Western media, but also perhaps, I don't read Ukrainian media, but I'm sure that there's denial there. Also, I just want to make a point that there have been many occasions where some sort of ghastly attack has occurred, and then a photo of the, say, a damaged building or one of these scenes of carnage, that photo will reappear in Ukrainian media or Western media, claiming that this is a Ukrainian town that's been bombed by Russia. I mean, right. It's rubbing salt in the wound, I guess. But
and who's sorry? Let me just. I want to pick up what you said, but let me just stop you there. Who is feeding that information to the legacy media? Like, if the picture appears of these kind of ghastly remains civilian remains you describe, and it ends up with the story that this was a Russian attack, how is that information filtering from there to the journalists who are misrepresenting what's happening?
I can't explain the process. All I can say is that they're probably following, because there isn't much media that's reporting it. So they would have to be following some of the independent media that are reporting it, and possibly also the local reporters from here or Russian media that are reporting on it. And then it's up to them to take that image and misuse it.
Right.
But I don't know, how it works. I know I've seen the same kind of thing done in terms of reports on Syria, because I've spent a lot of time reporting from Syria too. So it is not accidental by any means. Like one building in Donetsk that was hit by one of these HIMARS missiles, I believe it was in March or April. And so like the top 2 floors of the building were basically destroyed. And that exact image was shown in, I don't remember which publication. I could find it for you and send it to you later. It was shown in one of these Western media publications, claiming just what I've said, like that it was a Ukrainian town targeted by Russian airstrike or whatever. So it's anyway.
Let me ask you this too. Sorry, there's just so much here.
That's fine.
Okay. Am I, reporters back in the day used to go places and get it wrong sometimes. But how many reporters are actually there doing what you're doing and not sort of doing the laptop reporting from a hotel somewhere in the region and not actually seeing anything with their own 2 eyes? I'm just wondering, like, is there like a scrum of international war correspondents where you are, or how many people are there?
So there are, if we're talking about non-Russian, non-Donbass people, there are a number of people that have been living here. I know a French correspondent who's been living here for over 6 years. There's an American guy that's been living here for probably the same amount of time. So their names are pretty well known for anyone who's following this area closely. But in terms of especially larger international publications, no. There is a guy I know from Press TV. He comes and goes here, and he could be, I would say he's more like objective. Like it would be hard to accuse him of being a Russian propagandist.
Yeah.
But I mentioned that I was on a Ministry of Defense delegation in March, and there were some Western media. There were 2 mainstream French channels, and the delegation was only 2 days, and it was one day in the DPR, one day in the Lugansk People's Republic. We did go to some key areas that had just been taken by Russian and Donbass forces and spoke with people there. We saw humanitarian aid being handed out. We saw a hospital that had been destroyed. We talked to the chief physician there, who talked to us for about 5 minutes. I put that up on my YouTube, so no cherry picking of words there. Yeah. But that's what they did. They took about 2 or 3 seconds of him replying to some poorly worded question. He said, "I don't know." So that was their cherry picking to say he was saying he doesn't know why the hospital was destroyed. But in fact, he had explicitly said Ukrainian forces came in the hospital, they militarized it, and they mined it before leaving. So that's the part they left out. They also left out any mention of 8 years of war, Ukraine's war on the Donbass. Yeah. The first site we went to was the site of a March 14th missile attack. It's the system called Tuchka-U. It launches very powerful missiles, and they contain cluster munitions. And so this attack, March 14th attack, killed 21 civilians. It would have been worse, apparently, if the air defense had not shot down this missile. There would have been further spread of the clusters. So we were taken to that site where there was a number of photographs depicting the scene of that day. There's a memorial. There's no mention of that by these two French media. I know, because I went and I searched as many of their reports, which were not very many, I think 2 or 3, that I could find to see, are they going to report honestly about it? And they didn't. So I'm making this point because I know that Western journalists will say, well, we can't have access there, which might be true. Maybe you can't get a Russian visa. You would need that in order to come here. But even for those who do have access, they don't always tell the truth.
Yeah, well, we learned that, didn't we, over the years? I mean, anybody over the age of 50 knows that most of what comes out of war zones is nonsense until, history kind of picks it over and says, boy, was that ever stupid? That's what keeps happening over. I mean, it's like, I keep saying it's like Lucy and Charlie in the football. Every war has a crazy run-up full of propaganda. The war itself is propagandized, and then later they say, what the hell were we doing there? I mean, it's nuts, but like we never learn, But can I just ask you, personally, do you have a fixer? Are you there by yourself, or do you have someone helping you, or is it just like you?
I don't have a fixer, no. In fact, I've never had a fixer. So what I've done is I've worked with other journalists. I've in a sense, piggybacked, in a sense, to have like transportation to, because even if I were to try to hire a taxi, a lot of the times the places you want to go to, many drivers don't want to go there because it's too dangerous. Yeah. So I have joined RT journalists when I was reporting here in April, in May, and June, going with them and trying. And also I'm fully, upfront about the fact that my Russian language skills are almost nil, although they are improving each time I come here. So I have worked with other journalists in order to get to places, to do interviews. Yeah. But this time I've been working mostly on my own. As I mentioned, I did go with 2 different journalists. One was the Press TV journalist, and another was an independent Russian journalist. We hired a taxi to go to Gorlivka. And actually, kind of a funny story, an aside, but we had somebody from Gorlivka to take us to these villages because we don't know the route, and the taxi we'd hired was small, and it could only hold 5 people. So when this rather tall man joined us, there wasn't enough room for everybody. So we left the taxi driver and I drove. So I was driving from Gorlivka to these villages. It was pretty crazy because the roads in that region are really potholed. I think both a combination of that's how they historically have been, and also to some degree due to shelling. So driving was a bit of a nightmare, and trying to pay attention to the road, to the potholes, and to the potential at any point of incoming. Thankfully, there wasn't any incoming near us, but I read later, after we'd left Zaitsevo, maybe 2 hours later, the village was hit with 10 155 millimeter shells. Anyway, so all that to say, back to your question about a fixer, I don't have, and what I have in terms of the language gap is I use an online program. If the audio is clear enough, then it transcribes it, and then I translate it, and I can hear now enough Russian that I can I subtitle everything myself, so I can fix it manually myself to meet what's being said. But there are times when there's maybe local slang, or maybe people are talking at once, and I have a woman that volunteers to do transcriptions for me. So that's kind of how I do my things.
Okay, so I know we've got limited time today, Eva, so let's get to some of the more newsy kind of questions. I guess I'll start by asking you, for our very curious audience who is desperate for non-compromised information, what is the biggest misconception that you would say, being on the ground there, that people in the West reading and watching Legacy News would have about the conflict? What's the biggest propaganda effort around? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I can think of two main points offhand. One is related to the recent referendum, but I'll start with the first one. The first one is that Russia invaded here in 2014, right? And that didn't happen. We could argue, and I don't know the extent of Russia's support to the Donbass militias. I'm sure there was support. Maybe there wasn't. I don't know. I just don't know. But I know that when I came here in 2019 and I talked to people again in Donetsk and Gorlivka in the villages, that was one point they were emphasizing. They were saying, we want people to know there wasn't a Russian invasion here. And what they told me was in 2014, when the coup d'etat happened in Kiev, and I'm not sure how aware listeners are, but there were some horrific crimes happening at that time against civilians. One of which was in Odessa, where the kind of what's the word I'm looking for? The number the official number was like 40 to 50 people were killed in the Odessa trade union house fire. I've also seen reports that the numbers were higher, and the official narrative was that these people had gone into the trade union because there were some sort of riots, and they went in there to seek shelter, and the trade union building caught fire. But I know I've read and seen reports and videos that people in that building were assassinated, point blank assassinated.
Yeah.
So it was a massacre. People here were aware of the rise of this extremism in Ukraine. And again, I do state a caveat. I do not view all Ukrainians as holding these views at all, but you can't deny they exist.
And so what is the extremism? What is the view that they hold that you're talking about, just so people fully understand?
Yeah, well, I mentioned earlier the Azov Nazis. They're not the only Nazi group. They're one of a number of extremist groups in Ukraine that literally hold Nazi torch parades, that wear Nazi insignia, that many of them hold as their hero this figure, what's his name, Bandera. And they as far as Jews, they would be supremely anti-Semitic. And in fact, this Bandera, Stepan Bandera, I believe he was involved in crimes against Jews back in the Second World War. In any case, I'm not an expert on that. I can certainly direct people to other articles and researchers on that. But the basics are, they are the new Nazis. Not all Ukrainians, of course, but these exist, and they work within the Ukrainian military. They're embedded within the Ukrainian military. So they're not a few bad apples. Reporters that were on the ground in Mariupol when the battles there over that city were happening, there are countless testimonies. Even though I wasn't there at the time, I got there at the end of the battles. But certainly I've interviewed enough people who have spoken about these Nazis and their ideologies and about seeing these parades I mentioned. That's one element. They do not view the people here as human. You can find even Poroshenko, the former, what would he have been, president, I guess. There's a famous clip of him him speaking, I don't know what year this was, but anyway, sometime post 2014, saying, maybe it was 2017, saying of the people here in the Donbass, they will not work, they will not receive their pensions, they will live in basements and bomb shelters, and that's how they'll live, basically like that. You will find online, it's quite prolific, these people that hold these nationalist extremist views, that they don't believe the people here are human. They call them subhuman. They have a variety of names, one of which is orcs. I don't know the origin of that name, but basically they're very brazen in the fact that they see it totally acceptable to kill people here.
Because they are Russian? Is that why? Because they are Russian?
Because they're Russian. And back to your question, like about the, what was happening here in the early days, or why people, I can't remember your question, but anyway, the people who were saying, we don't want what's happening there to come to us. And like you said, we are Russians, we are Russian speakers. We don't want our history erased. We don't want the rewriting of history where Nazis are now glorified and the people that defeated Nazis are the villains. But also
Irony
they
there.
told me that they didn't necessarily seek autonomy at the beginning. They just didn't want what was happening elsewhere in Ukraine to happen to them. And shortly after, Ukraine started shelling them. So back to your question was like, what are the biggest myths? So
just before we move on from that, even let me just stop
here.
Let me just, one more thing I just want to say before we put a button in that just so people also fully understand that area has been being shelled since when? Since 2014 by Ukraine? I mean, this is not new, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And by the way, there were in 2014 and 2015 two different agreements, the Minsk Accords signed.
Yeah.
And, whereas the claims are that Russia invaded, in fact, Russia was standing back. They were always pushing for diplomacy, for the Donbass republics in Ukraine to come to some sort of agreement and come to a peace agreement. So what started in 2022 was Russia's actual boots on the ground.
Right. So let's move on to the other misconception you were about to tell me, I believe, about the vote there recently. There goes another shell of some sort, or landing, or going. I don't know.
That one was landing. That was distant. What direction would that have been? Probably Western Donetsk.
Wow.
Yeah. So I during the 5 days of the referendum, I went around with a couple of journalists, again, by taxi or by foot when possible. We went to areas where people from the voting commission, volunteers from the voting commission, were going from apartment to apartment, knocking on doors and saying, we're here if you want to vote, come out if you want to vote. Now, I will say there are some legitimate criticisms in that transparency wasn't a thing here. I mean, not transparency, privacy is what I meant to say. Like, you could, in many cases, see what the person was voting for. But the flip side of that is the people here didn't care because everybody wanted the same thing. Yeah. So they didn't. Some people, there was the very first voting I saw, there was like a binder put down as a screen. So in theory, you couldn't see what the person was voting. But in general, when I went with people from apartment to apartment, yeah, you could see what people were voting, but they didn't care. They had nothing to hide. The other thing is that I would ask people, aside from viewing the whole process of like them showing their passport as identification, them receiving one and only one ballot, in some cases having the privacy to make their tick, in most cases not, but again, not caring, and then depositing it in a sealed, transparent box. Aside from that, then I would interview people and I would just ask them basic questions. And I really try not to load my questions. I just ask, like, what do you think about the referendum, right? So that's pretty not loaded. And most times people would say, we've been waiting for this for 8 years. We wanted this in 2014. Finally, we're having this. That was the overriding answer I got. And then I said, I would ask, okay, and if the result is you will join Russia, what do you see will happen? And the overriding response was peace. They see that hopefully finally there would be an end to the 8 years of shelling. But the myth aspect is that Western media they're still saying it, and they're saying, oh, well, what they're saying is that people were forced to vote. They're saying they literally had machine guns to their heads. Now, what they're basing this on is I've seen one clip. I have no idea in which city, in which region it is, but it shows people going up a stairwell and a man with a gun going up behind them. I will unabashedly say, I did see soldiers standing in areas where voting was taking place, but they were standing, in my experiences, they were standing at a distance. They were no way interfering. They weren't even interacting, except that people would walk up and talk to them because they were locals. And they're soldiers from the region. Yeah. And so people were not intimidated. I mean, anybody who knows a little bit about body language, if you look at the videos I put out, there's one video in Makivka near Donetsk, and this grandmother pushes the little infant to run up to the soldier and take the candy from him. It's just like, and he's laughing and smiling, and they're totally relaxed. Like, you could argue that's staged, but it wasn't staged. And that's the myth, is that people were forced to vote. Now, the reason that the security were present, well, there's many reasons. One, to protect the ballot boxes from any sort of tampering. Another, there was from the Ukrainian side, there were channels. I can't cite an official source, but certainly there was the intent to try to disrupt the referendum by whatever means possible, by slashing tires. That was one instructive I saw that was given, I don't know by whom. So there was the possibility that Ukraine was going to try to disrupt the referendum. And that's one of the reasons these soldiers were present. On the other hand, can we not look at our own societies and ask, when we vote somewhere, is there not some sort of security? Maybe it's a policeman or security guard present. I mean, I think it's very hypocritical that we don't step back and look at how things go in our country. Maybe they don't look like a soldier holding a machine gun. But again, the people that I saw were not intimidated by this.
Well, that's the issue. If that's reasonably normal for them, then they wouldn't feel.
Yes.
It's like, do the people feel intimidated or not, right? And people feel intimidated under different circumstances depending on what their life is. But I'm understanding your sense of it after speaking to people was that they didn't feel intimidated.
Well, and the reason that the women were going, it was primarily women that I saw, were going door to door for the first 4 days. And then on the 5th day, they opened voting centers around the cities, was to minimize the possibility that large numbers of people would come at the same time and Ukraine would shell there. For example, one of the voting stations near where I'm staying was a school. And in May, I believe, that school was bombed. Up the stairs from my apartment, there are 3 burned out cars. And then about 20 meters further beyond, there's 4 burned out vehicles. And that's from this grad attack by Ukraine on this district in May. I wasn't here at the time, but certainly, I mean, it's like, this is why it's so real. Like, so if they could attack here in May, they could attack here on the referendum day. So the women that were volunteering with the commission, they were, by the way, putting themselves at risk, because some of the ones I met were in a district called Kyievsky, which is in the north of Donetsk, and that region is pounded by Ukrainian shelling all the time. And they said they knew they were at risk, but they thought it was better for them, a small group of them, to be at risk rather than a lot of people. And they also said when they would knock on doors, immediately they would hear people calling other people and saying, come on and come vote. So their neighbors were like, the neighbors, were calling one another to bring together the community to vote. So I don't know, it's something that I guess people can't understand, because it is a very different system than how ours operate in the West. But at the same time, you know, if you want to talk about guns to the head, if the voting stations have been open from day one, so for the 5 days of the referendum, and any of them had been hit, I mean, just the possibility that Ukraine would shell them, that's the gun to the head. The 8 years of shelling is the gun to the head. That's why they kept saying, we've been waiting for this for 8 years.
Yeah. I want to ask you about sort of how it's going, which is obviously it's kind of a loaded question to ask somebody in a war zone, but you know, we're getting 2 or 3 or 4 versions of it. The current narrative is that Ukrainian forces are making huge gains. They apparently have recaptured the Kharkiv region. That's what's being said this morning. And I know, like, you can only really know what's happening where you actually are. But what is your sense about how the war is actually going for each side?
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you said that I can only really know what's happening where I am, because that's very true. And also bearing in mind that when I travel somewhere, I generally don't have data on my phone. So, you know, the whole day of any sort of access to, yeah. So the whole day of access to any sort of news is lost. And then when I come back, you just have to be kind of tunnel visioned if you want to get your work done in a timely manner. So as far as like the battles, I can't speak to that. What I can say in general is that this is what I know, that Russia so far has not used a significant portion at all of its forces since February in what it calls a special military operation. And I know that there have been on the Ukrainian side claims of successes, like you said, in Kharkov and other regions, and they can claim that. But as I see it, it was more of a tactical decision for Russian forces to move back. Knowing that I can't speak in detail because I just haven't been following that closely, but in general, I'm aware that in some cases it has been a decision to pull back because there's no need to lose Russian soldiers guarding a particular area that's really of no value. And at the same time, you know, there's an ebb and flow of, there's a great, I would highly recommend people listen to Andrei Martyanov. He's a Russian military analyst. He can speak about these things far more competently than I can. But I think he was basically making the argument when people were freaking out over Kharkiv region. I think he was basically making that point. It's like, it's not a matter of like losing a portion of land or not. It's a matter of making strategic decisions.
Right. And I think the other maybe myth that needs to be blown up, and I certainly have heard this from Colonel Macgregor, who I've spoken to a couple of times, and who is...
Oh, excellent.
Yeah, he's terrific. And he's going to be on the show, this show. I think I might split you up just because you're both so good. But you know, I think the myth in the legacy media is that Russia has thrown everything it's got at this and it wasn't enough and now they're losing. And people who kind of objectively are looking at strategy and tactics saying, well, wait a minute, no, they haven't even begun. Like this was, they were not tentative is the wrong word, but restrained. I know that's not a nice word to say about evil person Putin, but there we go. Evil person Putin, but he didn't put everything on the line and he still hasn't put everything on the line, as I understand it. Is that correct?
That is correct. And I also just want to point out a difference in war tactics. Take the United States, for example, what they did in Iraq, what they did in Syria. I'm sure you're aware of the city of Raqqa in Syria and how devastated that was by the U.S. coalition's bombing of that city, just destroying it and killing, I don't know, it could be thousands of civilians. But you take that approach, the scorched earth approach, and that's not what Russia has been employing. And I want to make a point. The attacks on Donetsk from Ukraine are coming from different positions on the outskirts of the city. If Russia was to employ scorched earth, they could devastate those positions, you know, with heavy, I don't know what kind of heavy weaponry, but they could obliterate those positions and end the attacks on Donetsk. But my understanding is they're not doing that because that would mean heavy civilian losses.
Yeah.
So that's just a point people should keep in mind. But as for Russia having exhausted itself, this is a case of an inversion of reality. There's another person whose analysis I think is excellent. He has a military background. His name is Brian Bartlett. He has a channel called The New Atlas, and he talks quite a bit about, you know, we hear a lot about like more weapons going to Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. But since he does have this military background, he's able to say, you know, it's basically like, yeah, you can send them new weapons, but they're not going to be trained up on these weapons for a long time.
Yeah.
And he can speak more in depth about the actual losses in Ukrainian forces.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry about this. Someone's calling me on.
Do you have to take it? Go ahead and take it. Take it.
I wanted to. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, Dimitri, I will be just about 15 minutes. Okay, thank you, my friend. Thank you. I'm so sorry about that. I tried to close it.
Is that your driver?
No, it's a friend. It's actually, he's a journalist, a really excellent journalist that I worked with in 2019. And he very charitably served as my translator when I went to Gorlivka and these villages I was talking about. And just by chance, the other day I ran into him. I hadn't seen him at all this year. So we agreed to meet just to catch up. But I wanted to make a point. Yes, I don't believe by any stretch of the imagination that Russia has exhausted itself. I think it's been, as you rightly pointed out, restrained. I think the rules of the game are going to change now, given the referendum and the results, and given that Ukraine continues to shell what is now effectively Russian territory. But one other thing I didn't mention before when I was talking about Ukraine's bombing is that as of late July, they fired missiles containing cluster munitions containing petal mines. They have a few different names, but they're essentially these tiny little mines that are not powerful enough generally to kill you, but they're designed to rip off your foot or your hand, depending on, they're horrific things. I had seen a number of them in a Western Donetsk district. One day I went with an RT journalist to see the emergency services here, their sappers. They had collected a pile of them and they were going to detonate them. Now, first I saw a pile of them on an area of like land, and on this land there were also garden plots. So you would have people coming from these large apartment, Soviet style apartment buildings over to their plot of land to work the land. And I swear these things are impossible to see. Even when you see them on pavement and there's like an arrow pointing at them, I have a hard time seeing them.
Wow.
So imagine they're on land with grass and weeds, etc. and you have some grandmother going over to work on her land, and there goes her foot, the next day in the evening, I think it was, I wrote about it. I can certainly clarify the exact date, but I believe it was the end of July. Ukraine fired these shells containing these petal mines, and each shell contains about over 300 of these mines. And the mines are designed to kind of flutter down to the ground, and most of them don't detonate upon impact because they're designed, so they detonate upon, being stepped on. And they fired it right on the center of Donetsk, like areas where I am, like 200 meters. It might have even been in this area. But anyway, I went with the same RT journalist to document it. And some of the mines had been moved onto a curb. I don't know how, if somebody had scooped it up with this scoop device or how they'd been moved. They'd been moved so that people or cars wouldn't walk or drive over them. But they were marked, with a circle or an arrow or whatever danger mine. And the reason they weren't detonated at once is because you can't just do that with civilians walking and driving by, because there's the potential of bits of fragments of the mine or fragments of the asphalt or stones or whatever flying at high velocity, and also injuring or doing worse to civilians. So they would put the mines aside until they could locate all of them, and then they would deal with them as they could. But I saw them designated, and I could not decipher them. I could not see them. I saw them on the street. I saw them in a yard between two apartment blocks, and it's so insidious. And the other extremely insidious aspect is, if they didn't already land on the ground, if they landed in a tree limb or on a rooftop, then when it's windy or when it rains, they can get displaced. So then an area that has been deemed clear of these mines could potentially be infested with them again, meaning then you have someone who thinks, okay, I don't have to watch where I'm walking anymore, then suddenly lose a foot. As far as I know, at least 70 civilians have lost mostly feet, also hands, to these mines.
Oh, I don't like those at all. That's just ghastly.
Yeah.
I want to do a kind of a quickie round here with you. I have a bunch of stuff. I know you got to go, but how many of the people that you interact with there have some understanding that this is kind of a proxy war on behalf of the American State Department? Is the average Ukrainian fully aware of how much mucking about has happened there in their democratic process by America? Do they get it?
Yeah, especially the older generation, they definitely do. Yeah, I've definitely had them say, maybe not using the exact term proxy war, but like this is a war between America and Russia.
Wow. Okay. Sorry, just clearing my throat again.
Mm-hmm.
And then Nord Stream, obviously nobody knows for sure, but I think the smart money is on that America has done it. Is that talked about there, or is that just sort of too far afield for them to really be thinking about? And what's your opinion?
Well, as for whether it's talked about here, honestly, I don't know. It's not something I've been asking people. I could start doing. I suspect if it is talked about, most people would assume or just flat out say it was America. I also believe it was. I mean, if you just ask who benefits, it's not Russia that benefits from destroying its own infrastructure, which it then has to repair. Just as, by the way, when the battles there were happening. Yes, a lot of damage was done by Russian shelling of Ukrainian positions. Also, a lot of damage was done by Ukrainian shelling of apartment blocks of areas in Mariupol. And you have a lot of citizens that have said this. But then just logically, when you think about it, like, I know how Western media was depicting it. Oh, big bad Russia is just drooling blood and slamming, destroying wherever it can. But it's Russia who's rebuilding. I've been back to Mariupol. I went there actually on the first day of the referendum, saw people voting there, and then I was able to go see this new housing complex. It's going to be, I think, 3,000 apartment units. Pretty high-tech, very nice looking. I haven't had a chance yet to publish any footage on it. But this is Russia's doing. This is Russian funded, and I met the mayor of Mariupol when I was there by chance. He was at a place where the voting was happening. I'm like, somebody said that's the mayor. I said, I have to meet him, because one of the sources for all this propaganda with respect to Mariupol, the Western media cited the mayor of Mariupol, and he's not in Mariupol. He's somewhere, I don't know where he is. So I'm aware of some of the hoaxes he's put out. And so I did speak briefly with the mayor, and I said, did you know Western media is citing the mayor of Mariupol? And he said, that guy, whose name I don't remember, he left on February 26th. So he left about 2 days after the military operation began. So he fled the city. He left his city. So he's the guy nowhere near Mariupol, which Western media cite as a source for all their various claims of things that Russia is doing.
Yeah. Yes. Okay, let's move on to iodine pills being handed out. Is that happening?
It's also something I don't know.
Okay.
That's a good question.
Okay. And are people there talking about nukes? Is there a general sense amongst the citizenry there that there is a grave danger lurking in this conflict?
I think, if anything, what people are talking about more is the Ukraine's continued attacks on the nuclear power plant in the Zaporozhye region. Yeah. I mean, that poses the most, right now anyway, that poses a direct threat to people here. And Ukraine has been doing that for, how long has it been now? Like over a month, maybe 2 months, off and on. So I think that's probably more present in people's minds, but they might also, I honestly don't know if they're talking about the greater scenario.
Okay. And this, maybe this is too short of a time to finally ask you about this Justin Ling piece about you. Because I was just so blown away by how unfair it was and how ad hominem. And, I was at CBC for a long time back in the day. And to see that kind of journalism, I mean, when I was at As It Happens in the 1980s, we would have been interviewing you. You would have been one of the independent journals we would have turned to get around the propaganda, right? And now it feels like it's all narrative stitching. So I will have talked about what Justin Ling said and did in this story on CBC News about you and 2 other people. But what was, first of all, what was your response when you finally saw it? And what do you say to him, a person who I don't think has been to Ukraine? Has he? Has he set foot in the country? I don't know, but I suspect not. But please tell me your response.
Well, I mean, I don't know if he's ever been to Ukraine or not. So when I was contacted, I believe it was in early June, by a producer at CBC. And just as a preface, I have been smeared by most corporate media since 2016 for my reporting from Syria. Yeah. And I'm accustomed to the tone of the emails. Sometimes there's a veneer of, pretense of politeness.
There's a fake chirpiness to it that.
Absolutely. Yeah. But I know what is to come. So generally I don't even give them the honor of replying to them, because it's just a waste of my time. Yeah. So I just basically, what I do instead, because I think they should be exposed for their dirty tactics, what I did instead was screenshot the email without including the email address, and then put that on Twitter and say, okay, CBC is going to smear me. Just rewinding, there's a great independent media, I'm sure you know them, Maverick. And in late May, 2 journalists from Maverick had reached out to me, and they were very concerned about this, what is effectively a kill list. It's called Mirotvorets. It was established, I believe, in 2014. It's a site that includes the data, the names, and as much data as possible on people that Ukraine has deemed as a threat to their security, a threat to their state. Right. I was put on there in 2019 after I came here and after I went to Crimea. So I'm deemed all sorts of whatever threats to Ukraine. So they don't have that much data on me. They don't have my phone number, address, but they have put many Ukrainians themselves, journalists, members of parliament, just normal civilians. They have 327 children on that list, most of whom are in the Donbass. There's a 9-year-old girl on that list. This is ridiculous. And people have been killed after being put on that list, especially including Ukrainians. So anyway, I mentioned that because it is important. Maverick contacted me to talk about that issue. And at the end of our interview, they said, we're going to contact Canadian media. I said, okay, well, thank you. Good luck, but thank you. Being cynical. And I did follow up with them. They did contact CBC. And then a week later, I get this email saying they want to interview me about, I can't remember how they worded it. And when they finally produced this theatrical smear, complete with scary music, so they can show just what an awful person I am, the smear basically is based on the fact that I participated in a war crimes tribunal in Moscow Ukraine War Crimes Tribunal, giving my opinion on what I'd seen in the Donbass. And so that's what CBC went with. But you know how they framed it was that and I know for a fact that they took this information from my kill list entry because it has been updated from the 2019 entry to include my participation in this tribunal. But the kill list entry got the date wrong, and they said I participated in April. And in fact, I was in this tribunal in March, on March 11th. CBC also said in April. Therefore, you know, it's not coincidental that they both got the date wrong because CBC was drawing from the kill list entry. Yeah. So instead of contacting me and saying, hey, I'm concerned that a Canadian journalist is on a list, which is effectively a kill list, which could cause you some sort of harm, and you want to talk about that. No, they didn't do that. Instead, they drew from information on that list. And then they said, Eva Bartlett is basically being duped by this researcher named Maxim Grigoriev. And that's why they brought the other people into this smear, because they were trying to portray it as Maxim Grigoriev is this great puppeteer duping us all. But, you know, why did I come here in 2019 if Maxim Grigoriev was duping us, you know, about what's happening in this year? It's, you know, it's illogical. And so that was the other aspect of the smear was that they brought in this, I forget the name of the body, but it's some U.S. State Department funded body. Yeah. They brought in some expert there to talk about, you know, journalists like me, to smear me, to talk about, also, I think they probably took a jab at my work from Syria. And they also, although I have dozens of videos now on my YouTube, at the time, I think I had like 30 or so videos from here, including from 2019. They only included one video, a segment of a video of a woman I met who spoke English in Mariupol. And she basically said, we want to get rid of these people. I said, who are these crazy? She said, crazy people. I said, who are they? And she said, some people call them Nazis. And that's the only thing they included. They didn't include the videos I have of old people talking about Ukraine's attacks on their houses in Gorlivka area and how would they survive the winter because they live alone and they can't afford to patch up the roof and they're going to freeze. They didn't describe, you know, include any of those videos about Ukraine's terrorism, just that one little clip, to try to frame me as crazy for insinuating that there's a Nazi problem in Ukraine, even though Canadian media, as I said before, including I think the CBC, had acknowledged this issue.
Well, what was interesting to me is just how, because I'd been doing a lot of COVID coverage, which, as you may or may not know, has been covered very badly by legacy media. There's also an approved narrative there, of which Justin Ling was a part of too. I mean, he was a big kind of anti-vaxxer headline reporter. And never actually looked at safety data, or I couldn't find any reporting on it anyway from him. So what you were left with after watching that is a smear that you were being funded by Moscow in one way or another. That's what that guy from this kind of Bill Gatesian neocon think tank was saying about you. And I thought, you know, here is a guy, Justin Ling, sitting at a computer in Montreal, you know, reporting about somebody who's actually risking their butt in Ukraine, with a guy probably in DC who's funded by the very people who love and support this conflict on behalf of the State Department. I mean, it's mind-boggling that, I don't know what Ling's politics are. I don't know what his motive is. I don't know about it, and I won't hazard a guess, but I don't get it. And I was quite saddened by it, and you must have felt even worse about it, I guess, because it felt very ad hominem to me.
Well, you know, these types of smears don't affect me deeply anymore because I have grown thicker skin. And look, I'm not perfect. And everybody makes mistakes, but I know what I'm doing and what I'm saying. I believe in it. I do not have a problem with my conscience. I sleep well, except for being woken up by explosions. I sleep soundly at night. Except for also being disturbed by the things I'm seeing here. So I have no qualms whatsoever about my integrity. I have no issue, or like no problems, no doubts. I, again, don't know everything there is to know. I have a lot to learn, but I'm not lying here. And he is, you know, and this, I mean, okay, he was the guy that did it. But this was from CBC. This was from Government Canada. And I don't know if you can, after I'm done making a point here, if you could possibly speak about how much CBC is or isn't funded by Government Canada and how neutral they are or are not. But I have two things to say about this. Like, again, CBC was made aware of the existence of a kill list that has thousands of people's names on it, including one of their own citizens and many children, but chose not to address that issue. And on the other hand, by doing this smear on me, CBC Canada does have a Ukrainian diaspora, not all of whom will hold the same ideology, but certainly there are people that hold that ideology, this extremist pro-Nazi ideology. So CBC has flagged my name to them. So if I come back to Canada, maybe they wouldn't have known who Eva Bartlett is, but maybe now they do. And, you know, I do not believe for a moment that the government of Canada would protect me or anyone holding these ideologies to try to harm me. So, you know, it's quite dirty what CBC has done. I'm not surprised. But anyway, I think there was one. Oh, well, you know, I mentioned earlier, I'm staying in an apartment. It's cheaper than most hotels. I was staying for a brief period in August in a hotel where all the other journalists stay. So that's the reason I stayed there. It was convenient and easy to, you know, compare, you know, talk about what's going on or whatever. And on August 4th, the hotel was bombed, like just outside the hotel, 50 meters away, and then directly outside the hotel. There were 3 large explosions 200 meters away that preceded it. They were attacking a funeral procession occurring 200 meters away, again, not a military target. And then they extended their bombing, they being Ukraine, extended the bombing right up to the hotel. I was in the lobby just prior to the 5th blast, which blew in the glass of the lobby doors and windows. If I hadn't stepped out of the lobby to go to the bathroom, I would probably be alive, but I probably would have had a concussion and be shredded with glass. So, you know, Justin Lang is writing from Toronto.
Montreal, I think he's in Montreal.
Okay.
Yeah.
But journalists that come here, even if that, and by the way, I'm sorry, I'm kind of on a tangent here, but there are a number of other hotels that journalists stay in. The Park Inn is one of them. That's been attacked at least 2 times, including recently. And in Kherson, an RT team came under attack with, like, I believe it was with HIMAR fired missiles in it. It really did a lot of damage to the hotel. Thankfully, none of the RT journalists or cameramen were injured, but elsewhere in the hotel, I believe 2 people were killed. So this is becoming a thing now. When I first thought about, okay, maybe it was coincidental that Ukraine attacked right outside the hotel that day in August. But then I learned, well, the attack was with these 155 millimeter artillery, which are very precise. So I no longer think that it was accidental, especially given other hotels containing journalists have been attacked.
Yeah. Well, look, Eva, I know you've got to go, and I hope you go carefully, it sounds like. Does your mother follow your career? I don't know if she's got nerves of steel.
You know what? Bless my mom. When I lived in Gaza for 3 years over the course of 5 years, from 2008 to 2013. I was there during the 2008-9 war, 2008-2009 war on Gaza, and the 2012 war. And then we didn't have body armor, and we were dealing with F-16s and Apaches and drone strikes and warships and tanks and everything, you know. So it was literally like nowhere was safe. Gaza's a very tiny place. Yeah. And you very quickly got used to the fact that nowhere was safe, and you just had to either deal with it and get on with your life, like documenting and doing journalism, or you could huddle inside, but that's not in my nature. My poor mom dealt with me talking very openly about the fact that there were no bomb shelters, and was riding with medics and in the hard hit areas. Bless her, she never told me not to do it. I don't know how she kept going, but she has dementia now, so she's not aware of what's going on. So she's safe. She's not in one of these terrible nursing homes that did horrible things to Canadians. My brother's made very sure of, you know, doing the research that she was in an environment that would be the safest possible for her, including not being forcibly vaccinated. But she, on the one hand, she's, I guess, blissfully unaware of what's happening. So, yeah.
Well, I know that you're from Ontario, and I was going to ask you where, but I won't, given the controversy surrounding you right now. Maybe it's better that people don't know where your family lives, because things are nuts at the moment, aren't they?
They are. I mean, I know of other journalists whose family members have been targeted, not physically, but by the state. Like, there's a German journalist whose bank account was shut down simply by virtue of the fact that she reported from here, and said she actually she has documents. I haven't seen them, but other journalists have documents that were sent to her by Germany saying, you know, we're going to arrest you and hold you in prison for 3 years because she reported that Ukraine is committing war crimes, because what was one of her other offenses, calling it a special military operation, I think might have been one of her offenses. in any case, she's a journalist, and her parents' accounts were also closed. So her mother has actually moved from Germany to Russia to live with her. Other journalists are facing sanctions, potential sanctions. I don't know if Canada is going to go that route, but I wouldn't be surprised, So yeah, I think you're not wrong to err on the side of caution in terms of how much information is said about journalists reporting from places like this.
Okay, so I'm going to do something. Christine, our audio producer, just suggested that I ask you to hit your camera so I can get a shot of you, a screenshot of you in your location, given that seems to be an important part of the story, that you're even there in that place. Do you feel like doing that?
Yeah, we can do that. I'm just going to move it so that there's not really any visible indicators in the background.
Sure. You mean of where you are? Yeah, sure. Got
it. So just I have a white wall in the background. I mean, of course, people could say, well, she's just in a hotel in Toronto.
Well, unless you're running a soundtrack, obviously you're in a war zone. We can hear it loud and clear.
Well, and I did actually, on the September 22nd bombings of Central Donetsk, I don't normally film myself because that's not really my type of journalism. I prefer to film the people in question.
Yeah.
But that day, I had seen enough people trolling on Twitter and saying, oh, these are fake bodies, that's fake blood. And I was pretty furious about it. So I did do a selfie video of myself on the street saying, this is not fake, this is very real. These are real body parts. So there is verification of my existence here.
Yeah. Wow, what a life. So, look, I'm really thrilled you did this. Some interviews are kind of doomed, but the ones that are doomed when you finally do them end up being quite good. So I'm just thrilled to do this. And I also feel that we should probably have you on for a longer, at some point in the next few weeks, I'd like to have you on for like the full, 2 hours or something, and really get granular about what your experience there has been. So if you would do that, we'd be very, very grateful.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll probably be back in Moscow at that time. So
okay.
I'd have generally stable internet and a quieter environment, except for my dogs.
Oh, you've got dogs? Oh, me too. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I adopted 2 dogs when I moved there.
Oh, did you? Lovely, lovely.
Yeah.
Okay, Eva. Thanks very much. Look after yourself, and
thank you.
I know you're
so much.
I know you're making smart decisions because you're a pro. But I'll just reiterate that as a mom.
Thank you so much for having me on, and for your the knowledge that you brought to this conversation. I do appreciate that.
Okay, thanks, Eva. Have a good day. Okay, bye. That was Eva Bartlett reporting from, actually in Ukraine, reporting from the Donbass Russian-speaking region of the country, bringing you the other side of the story. And it's important we get both sides. What I'm getting at in this show is that we are virtually never told the truth about why we go to war. And the media is all in, sometimes for patriotic reasons, sometimes just because they're corrupt. And the low point in the lead up to the Iraq War, for me anyway, was the appearance by Colin Powell at the United Nations. Colin Powell was the Secretary of State, I believe the first Black Secretary of State, a general, handsome, well-spoken, lovely human being by all appearances, and highly, highly accomplished. But he was instructed to tell the United Nations during, I think, a special session, that there was evidence that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. And he did so. And everything he says in the clip that you are about to hear is a lie. But it created what they call the casus belli, which is the reason for war, and allowed George Bush to prosecute that war on a moral high ground basis. So listen to this clip of Colin Powell.
I cannot tell you everything that we know, but what I can share with you, when combined with what all of us have learned over the years, is deeply troubling. What you will see is an accumulation of facts and disturbing patterns of behavior. The facts in Iraq's behavior demonstrate that Saddam Hussein and his regime have made no effort to disarm as required by the international community. Indeed, the facts and Iraq's behavior show that Saddam Hussein and his regime are concealing their efforts to produce more weapons of mass destruction.
So that was the late General Colin Powell selling the WMD story at the United Nations in order to get America, help convince the citizenry that America should be involved in the Iraq War, which I don't think anybody now would say was anything but misbegotten and a mistake. So my point is, this is what happens when America wants to go to war. All truth-telling goes off the table as a noble lie, as they would say, is put forward to convince people to go along with the project. And I feel that's what's happening now in Ukraine. Yes, Putin invaded. There's no question about that, but it's a very, very complicated situation, suggesting that the Ukrainian military, that the Ukraine as a country did not have its own very, very serious problems it's just fantasy. And we all want the Ukraine people to be okay. And in my view, the best way to do that is to get to a peace agreement instead of escalating nukes and arguing about Nord Stream, which I think any sane person would probably think was done by anybody but Russia. It was not in Putin's interest to blow up his own pipeline. He could have just turned the gas off. So I want you to listen. You may not agree with everything said today. And if you don't, let me know, and I will read your letters and emails on an upcoming show about this. I really will. It's not simple. I don't have the answers. Colonel Macgregor doesn't have the answers. Eva Bartlett does not have the answers, but we're all trying to see through what they call the fog of war, which is often caused by the conflict itself, but the fog of war is also created purposely by the propaganda generated by the powers that want the conflict to take place. So we're all doing our best here, and I hope you'll have some patience with that. I want to let you know that tomorrow at 1 p.m., and that is GMT, that's British time, a human chain will surround Parliament to oppose the extradition of Julian Assange. And, if they can silence Julian, they can silence anyone. So thousands of others are going to stand up for press and media freedom everywhere. Free Assange human chain, going to surround Parliament in Britain. And I know that there are going to be events happening all around the world. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find the information on Canada. I've been so involved in the other story, the Ukraine-Russia story this week, that I wasn't able to locate what is happening in Canada, but I'm sure things are happening. So look up Don't Extradite Assange and also the human chain, and I'm sure you will find some events in Canada and in other places. And also on social media, there is the Defend Assange campaign. Randy Credico also has some information on this. So please do think about Julian Assange. I must say too, it was quite interesting to watch on Piers Morgan. They had John Bolton on, this terrible neocon who's never seen a war he didn't like, and Julian Assange's wife, who just nailed him for the stupidity that he was saying on Piers Morgan last night about Julian. So that was nice to watch. And also you will notice that our old friend Oliver Stone, who was on the show, is also making an appeal on the human chain, and Free Assange Now is the hashtag. So check it out on social media. I'm sure you will find a way to take part in this. Here is just coming across, Hands Off Assange in Washington, D.C. There is also an event with speakers. So please try to find an event. And if there isn't anything in your area, maybe get on social media and give some support to this, because I'll tell you what I know. I know that Julian Assange is not well, and he may well die in prison. And if he is extradited to Washington to face charges, they will put him away and he will die in prison in America. So please think of him. He is the canary in the coal mine of free speech. There's no question. Whether you agree with everything he did or not, the media loved this guy. They loved him until he turned on Hillary Clinton. That's my view. That's, I think, what happened. So do think about him and see if there's an event that you can take part in. And if you can't, do something on social media. Anyway, I hope this show was useful for y'all. We worked really hard to put it together. I'm feeling a lot of anxiety about what's happening in Ukraine right now, but we got to face it. We have to face what's going on and stay informed. And I'm telling you, you are not getting the truth from legacy media. So seek out sources. Look for Eva Bartlett's work and the work of other people who are telling the truth about Ukraine. And also follow Colonel Macgregor. See where he's speaking, what other interviews he's doing, and follow him. Stay critical. See ya.